Hello, a very warm welcome to you. This is another episode of Budget Podcast. I am Nancy Odimego. Good to have you join us. Recently, President Muhammadu Buhari presented the proposed 2022 budget to the National Assembly. To help us make sense of its details, we'll be having the head Research and Policy Advisory of Budget, Abel Akeni, as well as senior analyst Inyobong Osen. They are going to be taking us through the analysis of the proposed budget. Good to have you join us, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy.
Hi, Abel. How are you doing?
Hi, Nancy. Hello, Inyobong. It's good to be with you guys once again.
Thank you for joining us. So today we are just going to focus on the proposed budget for 2022. Just give us a rundown of the critical things that we need to note. So let's start with you, Abel.
Great. First and foremost, I think we should start by commending the federal government.
Okay.
There are critical areas where we think the federal government is doing very well, and there are areas where we would like to see a lot more improvement. Starting from areas for commendation, I would say that the government has done very well by releasing the budget proposal very early and putting it out on the budget office website as early as it did. So this gives both citizens and the National Assembly adequate time for public scrutiny to look through the budget plans and actually raise alarm where there are suspicions of potential loopholes for fraud, and also highlight issues that have not yet been captured in the budget so that appropriate provisions can be made. So I think that's a very good thing to commend the president about. But beyond that, I would say there are other aspects of the budget that have not done so well. So if you think about it, we are going to be spending about 16 trillion. 16.39 trillion.
Yeah.
Of that amount, we are projecting to raise just 10 trillion naira in revenue. So that gives you a very large deficit. The deficit is as large as about 6 trillion, which will push the country to borrow that much from the different lenders. So that's a cause for concern, and it's something that needs to be looked at. And then we have the breakdown of the revenue projections amounts to come in from oil and non-oil revenue. For the non-oil component, there are some projections that are heartwarming, but there are also projections that maybe besides reality. If you look at the performance of the country over time when it comes to revenue, I don't think we've done as high as 5 trillion in the past, right? So if we've not done that high and suddenly you're projecting about 10 trillion, how are you going to make or raise that amount of money, when you've really not done up to half of that amount, at least in the last 6 years of your administration? What are you going to do differently to achieve it? It's important to let Nigerians know that aspect. So I think I should also mention that one of the things that, or one of the reasons why citizens need to pay attention to this year's budget is that it's the last next year's budget, is that it's the last full year budget of Mr. President's administration. And it's also a budget that is coming in an election year. And if you know the thing with Nigerian politicians, when the administrations are about to end, as we saw with the previous administration before Buhari came in, there is the possibility that a lot of the political appointees of Mr. President will want to maximize their time and sign potentially inflated or frivolous contracts. And so there's just a heightened risk for corruption, given the importance and significance of that year in the political calendar of both political parties.
All right, so thank you very much. Now let's move over to Ini. Let's have Ini on this one. Your team raised concern about the NDDC aspect of the federal government budget. So can you shed more light on this issue?
So the NDDC was or is an interventionist agency that was set up to address the socio-economic needs of the persons in the Niger Delta, stemming from a lot of the socio-economic environmental damage, that has resulted from the exploration and development of oil and gas assets in the Niger Delta. But what we've seen over time is that this agency that was set up as a tool for development has been a vehicle for underdevelopment over time and a cesspool of corruption. So apart from the usual statutory allocation that accrues to that particular agency for the development of the Niger Delta annually, there's legislation that mandates oil companies to remit 3% of their annual budgets to the NDDC. And over time, we've had very little visibility, transparency on these funds that have accrued to the NDDC over time. So you walk, across the length and breadth of the Niger Delta, and what you see are abandoned projects by the NDDC littered all over the place. So that the NDDC has not, been able to carry out its mandate of development, and sort of provide value for money for the people of the Niger Delta. And in this year's budget, the 2022 budget, we've seen that very little has been done to show how the average of 198 billion naira, which has accrued to the NDDC as 3% company payment over between 2017 and 2019, displayed in the budget, right? If you look at the budget of the NDDC in this 2022 Appropriation Act, you would see that there was no breakdown, of the projects, the activities that the NDDC, has sought to embark on in the 2022 year. And what does this do? It leaves a lot of room for corruption.
Okay.
As we can see with what happened with the probe, with the NDDC in the House of Reps last year, where there were revelations that the NDDC spent about 1.5 billion naira as on palliatives for senior members of staff of the NDDC, right? So if there was a budget, for this huge revenue that accrues to the NDDC, you would not have, had a situation where the NDDC would have allocated the sum of 1.5 billion naira, as palliatives for, members ranked high in the management of the NDDC. So we are calling for visibility, transparency, as it regards the utilization of company payments by the NDDC in the 2022 budget.
I think the NDDC problem is a very serious one with the budget, especially because we have a situation where it's not only NDDC we see this problem occurring at. It's bad enough that there's no breakdown for the NDDC budget, but that's not where it stops. There's more than 1 trillion naira across different types of projects for which the government will spend money in 2022, which the government has not included in the 2022 budget proposal for public debate. Beyond the NDDC, you have expenditures on petrol subsidy. We saw that within 6 months in 2021 alone, the government has spent over 540 billion naira on subsidy. Now, what are the estimates for 2022, and why is it not being put out for debate? How does the government arrive at the figure to spend on subsidy? And this is not us accusing the government of fraud outrightly, but the truth remains that once there is opacity in how it arrives at its calculations, and the details are left to just a few men and women, there is always the risk for corruption, as we saw in the subsidy scandals of time past. Another aspect that also needs to be accounted for in the 2022 budget is payments for electricity subsidy. It's important that the government accounts for how much it intends to spend on electricity subsidy. From data available in 2019, the government spent over 500 billion subsidizing electricity for Nigerians. I think it's important for a figure that large. It's important for the government to annually include the estimate and subject it to public scrutiny. And the government even stands more to benefit, because ultimately more Nigerians will be aware aware that their electricity is being subsidized. Because if you walk up to the average Nigerian and say, hey, you're paying lesser than the market value of your electricity, the government is subsidizing for you. Not many people are even aware of that, but we have hundreds of billions being poured in that direction.
So what are the trends, right? Some of the trends now in Nigeria's deficit.
Okay, so to start with, I would say for the deficit, I think I mentioned earlier on that we have a 6 trillion naira deficit,
yes,
and if you think about it, about 80% of this funding for the deficit will come from borrowed funds. So the government will have to borrow about 5 trillion naira to finance that deficit, which is the difference between its estimated revenue and its total expenditure. The 5 trillion naira that the government is going to borrow, intends to borrow in 2022, is equivalent to the total budget for the country, for the federal government in 2015, and it's more than 5 times what the government borrowed in 2015 according to the budget implementation report. So that is 5 times. So what we borrowed in 2015, the government is not only going to double it or triple it, it wants to borrow 5 times that amount. So that's how large the deficit is for 2022, and it's something that should concern Nigerians. It's something Nigerians should look into and identify if there are actually bogus projects or inflated projects that are pushing the amount of money this far. And this is not to say in the grand scheme of things that 16 trillion naira is a lot. As a matter of fact, if the government really spends up to 30 trillion, that would be welcome. But are they spending this money on projects that benefit the masses, or are they spending it on inflated contracts and inflated projects that will go into the pockets of private individuals? But beyond that, once you borrow about 5 trillion in a single year, some of these funds you may want to take them from foreign lenders, and you expose the country increasingly to risks from exchange rate volatility. And what do we mean by that? The currency, Nigeria's currency, is currently very weak. The naira to dollar exchange rate is about 410 naira to a dollar, even though in the black market it's trading as high as about 580. If you rewind or you go back memory lane about 6 years, there was a time when the naira to dollar was trading at about 150 naira to a dollar. So my point is, if you had taken a loan of $1 million then, you would need just about 150 million naira to pay back that loan. But if you still owe that money by as at today, 2021, you would need 410 million naira to pay back the same amount of loan. So in essence, your debt burden has shot up as a result of the volatile exchange rate, without necessarily adding any value to the Nigerian people. So in reality, increasing the total debt profile of the country, especially if they are going to rely on foreign debt, increases the country's risk from exchange rate volatility. And then if they're going to take a lot of it from domestic debt, what we would have is a situation where the government is essentially crowding out the private sector, and it's essentially crowding out small entrepreneurs, because what is happening is that it will be competing for borrowed funds with entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs also need money from the capital market, from the banks. They need money to run their business, to operate their working capital. And if you have the your government also needing as much as 5 trillion extra, the total amount of money that's available to be distributed both amongst the government and amongst private entrepreneurs is significantly reduced. So entrepreneurs will be crowded out. There'll be less money available for businesses to thrive, and that's not a very good or healthy thing if we really want to promote small businesses and medium-sized businesses in the long run. One of the things we also need to consider is how sustainable some of all these debts are. And for us, we think that you are having, or a country is having, debt sustainability problem when it is struggling to service that debt. And by servicing the debt, we mean the amount of money the country will pay in terms of interest due to the lenders from which it took this money. And if you see the pattern over time, Nigeria is already beginning to struggle with paying or servicing our debt. I think in 2016 we were spending about half of our revenue, which is, to be precise, about 46% of our revenue, just to service our debt. Then as of 2020, that money had gone up to about 97.7%. So we're spending nearly 97% of our revenue just to service past debt. What that meant is that you had less than 3% of all the revenue the government made in that year available for capital infrastructure, and available for recurrent expenditures, for paying salaries, for paying pensions. So the government had to borrow to pay pensions in 2020, and the government had to borrow to finance all its roads projects, the bridges it built, and things like that. So the implication of accumulating more debt when you have limited revenue capacity is that you ultimately have to spend nearly all of your revenue servicing past debts, and you get yourself into what was referred to as a debt trap, because ultimately you're spending your revenue to service past debts, meaning that you now need to even borrow more if you need to embark on any meaningful project in a particular year. So we think those are the risks concerning the deficit. And if you think about it, Nigeria doesn't exactly have a problem with laws. There are fiscal regulations and laws that should prevent these types of situations from happening. If you look at the, I think Section 12, subsection 1 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, passed in 2007, you'll find out that the government or the law actually stipulates that your borrowing should not exceed 3% of the GDP, the gross domestic product of the country. But what you have that the president has proposed for 2022 is that the amount of money it intends to borrow is 3.39% of the GDP. So the government has essentially breached the threshold that's meant to safeguard the country from running into further debt traps. So this administration has breached that ceiling, and it's something for all Nigerians to be concerned about.
So thank you so much, Abel. Now let's look at this revenue projection, right? What the federal government has planned for the budget is 16.39 trillion naira, and what they've said that they are going to generate in terms of revenue is 10 trillion naira. What do you think, Ini? What do you think about this particular figure?
I know that Abel has spoken a lot about revenue, so I'll just add a little to it. If you look at the trend over time, right, Nigeria has never raised up to 6 trillion naira in revenue.
So why would they put 10 trillion naira?
What would the rationale be for raising 10 trillion naira in 2021? You know, it leaves a lot. Sorry, in 2022 rather. There's a lot, left to be desired. And what does that mean? It would mean that the government would now need to borrow more to be able to fund public expenditure.
Yeah. And
because there is actually zero plan in the budget for getting an overdraft from the CBN, right? So the CBN now, the federal government now resorts to going over the threshold, which the law allows, to get overdraft from the CBN.
Okay.
Because according to the CBN Act, the federal government is only allowed to borrow 5% of the previous year's revenue from the CBN as overdraft.
Okay.
Right? But the trend we have seen over the last couple of years is that the federal government always ends up borrowing over 50% of the previous year's revenue from the CBN as overdraft. And these sort of borrowings have not been captured in the 2022 budget or even in the previous year's budget, right? And this sort of borrowing also has not been captured as part of Nigeria's debt profile. So there's that risk for borrowing from what I would call irregular sources, because the fiscal space doesn't envisage that you would go outside the regular, vehicles or measures for borrowing by going to get an overdraft from the CBN, because this would usually have an inflationary effect, on the economy and so many other macroeconomic consequences. So in terms of the revenue aspirations of the federal government, if you use the benefit of hindsight, you can, sort of categorically say that the federal government would definitely not be able to meet up with the projections for for 2022.
Let me briefly interject here a bit, just to complement what Ini has said. Beyond the effect on debt and borrowing from the CBN more than it's anticipated, one of the biggest effects that would have on the fiscal space is that you have a situation where you have promised MDAs and Nigerians that you're going to spend or you're going to get 10 trillion. Yes. Now, these MDAs are going to enter into contracts and embark on projects with the anticipation that 10 trillion naira is coming, and then you're going to borrow 5 trillion to complement it. Now, even if you successfully borrow 5 trillion and then you have a problem with raising up to 10 trillion, now he has also mentioned that you have to borrow to complete you have to borrow more than you anticipated to complete that 10 trillion. Now, in the event that you're unable to find lenders to advance you that money, what you would face is a situation where the country would not be able to pay some of the contractors which have entered into contracts with the MDAs, and then you would have more abandoned projects across the country. And this has been one of the key reasons why the country has had more than 11,800 abandoned projects in the last 40 years, because every year the government comes up with revenue projections that are not that it's unable to attain. Ultimately it misses the target, and then contractors are left hanging because there's no money to pay them, and many of these contracts maybe the money ends up being siphoned or the projects are completely abandoned. And let's also keep in mind 2022 is an election campaign year, so a lot of the MDAs and a lot of unscrupulous politicians will be looking at maximizing that opportunity. So you would have many of them signing all sorts of contracts. You have many political contractors trying to cash out before their tenures expire. So that's something to be concerned about. And if I'm going to stay a bit more on the revenue problem, projection, right? The 10 trillion naira the government is projecting, 10 trillion naira to be achieved. Now, one of the things we've seen over the years is that there are significant leakages in the system, which always prevents the government from hitting its target. I think earlier in the year we had the Fiscal Responsibility Commission actually come up and say 33 agencies were not remitting about 1.2 trillion to the coffers of the federal government. So if you have 33 agencies who are powerful enough not to remit revenue that has come into the government, right? And no action was taken against the heads of those agencies, what is the guarantee that Nigerians have that in 2022 we won't see a repeat of similar behavior? And if we see a repeat of similar behaviors where some MDAs are holding the country to ransom, how does the government really intend to hit this huge 10 trillion naira target it has projected? And let's also keep in mind that some of the projections the government has made in the past, specific components, have performed woefully. But if we take a component like say stamp duties, which they now call, I think, electronic levy now. So for stamp duties, I think in 2021 they projected to raise about 500 billion from stamp duties, and if you prorate it from January to August, that's a projection of about 333 billion. But as at August, the government was only able to raise 9.8 billion from the projected 333 billion. So that's less than 3%. I mean, it's just a tiny drop in the ocean, right? So if you are performing so poorly on a revenue line item for which you anticipate to get 500 billion, right? What's the confidence that Nigerians have that your revenue projection figures in the next year, 2022, will be any different? What are you doing differently to prevent this situation from happening in the next forthcoming year? So these are some of our concerns concerning the revenue.
Thank you so much, Ewa. So are there any other issues that cause for concern in the budget?
One of the things that are of great concern to accountability actors like budget, right, are actually the priorities of government. I know you have been following the news in the last couple of days, with the budget defense going on at the National Assembly, where you have competing needs for limited resources, and you are not able to prioritize expenditure. Why should you, be seeking to borrow $200 million to buy mosquito nets, right? In an era where revenues are very difficult to come by, right? So we've seen a situation where it would look like the government is telling everybody to sort of tighten their belts, but our appetite for what I would call inanities, right, has not reduced as a government. Just yesterday also, the Senate had refused the advances of government to borrow about over 200 billion naira for water projects across the country. So that the ability of the government to prioritize in the face of dwindling resources from several sources seems to be a very critical issue. One other issue he also raised earlier in the course of the conversation is also around petroleum subsidy, right? Where revenues at the NNPC should have remitted to the Federation account for onward disbursements to several subnational units, right, have been used to pay for fuel subsidy. And there has been very little transparency on what exactly the country consumes, on a daily basis, for us to know for a fact if what is being reported as fuel subsidy payments actually are what it is. Because what is, what the implications for this is that there's very little remaining in the purse for onward disbursement to several subnational units. So states are not able to carry out critical expenditures, in critical social sectors of their respective economies, right? The education sector suffers, health suffers, agri suffers, and economic activities in a lot of these states will not be able to be stimulated sort of to boost the GDP, and the states can actually generate enough revenues also to spend in these respective states. Abel, I don't know if you have other
issues for concern
also.
But maybe, okay.
So I think one of the things I will add that is a cause for concern is fragmentation of the capital projects or the capital budgets in the country. We see that if you look at the budget, we have over 14,000 different capital projects to be implemented. Some of them as little as 2 million naira, 5 million naira. Now, when you fragment a budget or a capital spending plan that's already very little, there is a limit to how much impact that budget can ultimately have. And we've seen situations where some of these capital projects are suffering from what we call capital budget padding, meaning that many of these projects, if you unpack them, they are in reality not capital in nature. I think last year in the this year in 2021 budget, we observed that there were about 112 project line items that were captured as capital projects, worth about 2.8 billion. But in reality, these were allocations for meetings, for conferences, for different MDAs. So how do you capture a conference as a capital project and expect the masses to have confidence in that budget? How do you capture board meetings? How do you capture board meetings as capital projects? So we've seen those situations also repeating themselves in the 2022 proposed budget. You have provisions for quarterly interaction with the foreign media and PRO lobby for about 48 million naira captured as a capital project in one of the agencies. Then you have several instances like that. So capital project padding is also a big concern. It's a big concern with the 2022 budget. And if I move on from capital padding or capital project padding, I think another critical issue we would touch on is the problem of inflated contracts. We have situations where monies that should be spread across more projects are concentrated in a few, potentially for the benefit of a few individuals. And I'll give one example very quickly before we move on. And it has to do with the presidential wing of the State House Medical Center.
All right.
Now, the State House Medical Center we all know our president has had health issues, but unfortunately, as is typical of everything in Nigeria, for 6 years, he has been unable to complete the presidential wing in the State House Medical Center. And as of 2019, the budget had requested for 395 million to complete the construction of just the presidential wing. In 2020, they also requested for 416 million to complete that same presidential wing. In 2021, they requested for 1 billion to complete the presidential wing of the hospital. Now, in 2022 proposed budget, they are now requesting for 21.9 billion to complete that same presidential wing. So such an astronomical jump from 395 million to 21.9 billion is a huge jump that we are struggling to justify why it will take that amount of money just to complete a wing of the State House Medical Center, and this does not even include cost for equipments to furnish and equip the wing. This is just cost for construction, and it's a cause for concern for us because the president just has a few months from the end of 2022 to leave. So what does he want to achieve with the presidential wing with 21 billion that he was unable to do since the beginning of the tenure? And Nigerians have reasons, legitimate ones, to be concerned about this because this is an election campaign year, and if the presidency is requesting for 21 billion just to complete a wing for which they've been unable to do in the last 6 years, it's an expenditure that we think Nigerians need to look at, and we think the National Assembly needs to cut that expenditure down to size and allocate just what is necessary to complete it. So you have instances like this across the budget, across different MDAs, where you have projects that should be implemented with X naira. You have 10 or 20 times that amount of money allocated to such projects. So those are some of the concerns we have with the budget.
Okay, so before I let both of you go, let's talk about sectorial analysis, right? So what is the spread of allocation?
Okay, so if I talk about the spread of allocations across the different sectors, I would say it's pretty fair. But the largest chunk of the expenditure so far we've seen is going to security. Security is taking a large chunk of the expenditures. Then you also have some decent amount of money going to health, and also to education. And there are good allocations for the implementation of the new poverty eradication strategy. But the concern with a lot of those is if the allocations will be used judiciously. So by and large, there have been some fair allocations across the different sectors. We would wish that certain sectors have more money, like the health and the education. But let's keep in mind that the country also has a revenue crisis, and it's not raising as much as its capacity or as it should be able to raise. So by and large, there's a fair spread of allocations across the sectors, broadly speaking, the highest being security. And again, this is not to be pessimistic. There is a concept called conflict entrepreneurship, right? And what it means is that once there's more money flowing to a particular region for a particular purpose, right, even if it's for a conflict, there is a risk that that conflict will never come to an end because there are different state and non-state actors that are making significant amount of money from the conflict. Those who are supplying arms and ammunition, those who are supplying maybe services in the war zone. There are people who would want these conflicts to go on for as long as possible. So that's also a big risk. You have about 2.5 trillion going to security, which is police, defense, immigration, and all of that. And we know that some of the war against Boko Haram has gone on for more than a decade, and not just Boko Haram, against different extremists,
insurgents in general.
Insurgents in general. So a concern for us, or a problem for Nigerians to think through, is how does Nigeria win itself of that war, so we can free up some of the allocations going to security for other developmental projects, because what we've seen is that the more money this administration pumps into security, the worse it gets. And a question Nigerians may want to ask themselves is, do you feel safer now than you felt 6 years ago? Do your kids feel safe when they leave the house and head to schools? Are you at peace when your kids are learning at school, or are you scared that you'll be kidnapped? You'll find out that the situation has worsened over time. So I think the country needs to rethink the strategy with which it implements the funding allocated to some of these sectors, and in a lot of the sectors, specifically for infrastructure. Across construction of roads, water, and other components that make up the infrastructure sector. They will be getting, I think, about 1.2 trillion for implementation of different projects. But from our cursory overview of the line items for some of those MDAs, we think that there are projects that can be implemented through PPPs, public-private partnerships, that should be able to free up the little revenue left for critical projects in the respective sectors. And I give an example here. We have a budget in one of the ministries for construction of driver development centers across 6 geopolitical zones for about 3 billion naira, so which is just a glorified name for driver training school. Right? So why should the government be spending about 3 billion on constructing driving schools across 6 geopolitical zones when it could get different private sector actors to basically sort that out? So we think there should be more efforts as it concerns collaboration with the private sector to implement some of these projects, as opposed to governments wanting to do nearly everything from the thin revenue that it has allocated.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Abel. Abel is the head research and policy advisory, and we equally had a senior analyst with budget, Ini Hussein. Thank you so much, Ini.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you too, Nancy.
Thank you for joining us in the conversation today. That was a quick run, an analysis of the proposed 2022 budget. You can keep your observations and comments coming in on our social media handle. On Twitter, it's at BudgetNG. On Facebook, it's BudgetNG. And on Instagram, it's also BudgetNG. I am Nancy. Until next time, do have a wonderful day.